John Millington Synge was an Irish writer and playwright, best known for his intensely poetic works, which made him a key figure of the Irish literary revival in the early 1900s. Many readers will be familiar with his plays Riders to the Sea and The Playboy of the Western World, both of which are performed in a distinctive Irish English, and both of which show an unromantic view of Irish peasant life. However, many readers may not be aware that before he became a playwright, he originally intended to become a musician and then an academic, and had no interest at all in writing about his homeland. In fact, he moved to Paris at age 23, intent on studying languages and starting a career writing about foreign authors. So today on Out of the Page, I want to take a look at the experiences which shaped Synge's life and turned him from just another student expat to one of the most important figures in Irish literary history. Quick background for those who need it. J.M. Synge was born in Dublin in 1871 to a middle-class family. For most of his childhood, his artistic interests were in music, and he studied and played multiple instruments. He went to Germany in 1893 to focus solely on studying music, but eventually decided against it, mainly from a fear of public performance. He then travelled to France and Italy in order to study languages with ideas of becoming a literary critic. In 1895, he proposed to a young Irish woman, and after being rejected, resolved to leave Ireland behind him and move to Paris. In 1896, however, he had a fateful meeting which changed his life forever. On a cold December night, he was introduced to the poet and dramatist William Butler Yeats at the Hotel Cornet. In Yeats' own words, Synge was at the time poor, lost, and depressed, and Yeats advised him to abandon his writing on foreign authors and instead to visit the Aran Islands off Ireland's west coast to find a life that has never been expressed in literature. The importance of this advice from Yeats cannot be overstated. At the time, Synge was studying and writing about authors whose lives he had no connection to, and Yeats recognized this in him. His advice to travel to the wild Aran Islands was to give Synge a way of connecting to his ancient roots, and to be able to express something in writing that very few other writers would have the opportunity to. A year later, Synge took the advice and spent 5 consecutive summers living on the Aran Islands. Shortly afterwards, he penned 2 of his most famous works, Riders to the Sea and In the Shadow of the Glen, followed a couple of years later by The Playboy of the Western World. Synge died quite young at the age of 37 in 1909, but still managed to plant himself firmly at the front of the Irish literary revival. But let's step back to when Synge first visited the Aran Islands. The Arans themselves are 3 separate land masses in Galway Bay off the windy west coast of Ireland. At the time Synge visited, they had a population of less than 3,000 inhabitants, primarily speaking Gaelic and living a life far closer to that of the ancient Irish than the modern life in Dublin that Synge was used to. During his summers in the Arans, Synge made friends with the inhabitants and lived freely amongst them. He explored their villages and ruins, he helped farm and fish, and he came to fall in love with the simplicity and in many respects the brutality of their daily lives. He celebrated birthdays and attended funerals, and mourned the loss of friends who left the islands for a better life on the mainland or in America. In return, the people of the Arans accepted him, helped him learn the Irish language, and helped him grow close to a world he'd never known before. All of this is collected in his first non-fiction book called The Aran Islands, where the influence of the land and the people becomes the most apparent. This was the first time in Synge's life that he'd experienced such a harsh, raw existence, and he began to see a poetic, mythic beauty in it. For example, he writes, "I'm in the North Island again, looking out with a singular sensation to the cliffs across the Sound. It is hard to believe that those hovels I can just see in the south are filled with people whose lives have that strange quality that is found in the oldest poetry and legend." Through his acquaintances on the islands, he was told folk stories and local myths which found their way into his later writing. The plot for In the Shadow of the Glen is actually based on a folk story he was told on the islands, and Riders to the Sea was actually set on the Arans themselves. So by immersing himself in life in the local communities, Synge began to experience that life that had never been expressed in literature and endeavoured to find a way to put that into his own writing. His subsequent plays were written in the spirit of mythology and folktale, and their settings were inspired by the rough and wild land he lived on, as well as the people he lived among. Then, of course, is the language itself. The richness and rhythm of the speech, as well as the words he used, were directly inspired by life on the Arans, as well as by his subsequent life back in Ireland. In the preface to The Playboy of the Western World, he wrote how much of the dialect he used was taken directly from his time in Wicklow County, where he would listen through a chink in the floor to the servant girls speaking in the kitchen. He wasn't interested in portraying speech as poetic for the sake of artistry. What he wanted was to write in a way that was authentic and showed things how they truly were. And that really is the core of the matter. John Millington Synge, although an exceptionally talented writer, would likely never have been able to write the plays that he did had it not been for his time on the Aran Islands, where he discovered a love for his homeland, and where for the first time he was able to write not from imagination, but from experience. Of course, there are many other influences that are necessary to understand to fully appreciate Synge's writing, such as religion and the spirit of Irish politics at the time. But what underpins it all are the stories of his homeland and the influence of the wild. Thank you so much for watching. This video was written in conjunction with another about Jack London's life on the road, and the theme of both is the authority gained from experience. So keep an eye out for that because it'll be out soon. I am obviously a big fan of J.M. Synge's writing. My favorite is Riders to the Sea, so I'd love to know what yours is and what you most appreciate about the small but immense output that he had in his life. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel if you like. I will be back soon, so until then, I will see you later.